Good evening, everyone. This is Shadowy Stories, and tonight we continue our adaptation series of weird tales. Last time, we introduced the most popular writer of the magazine, Seabury Quinn. His career experiences are incredibly diverse. One of them was working as a government lawyer, which gave him access to many real cases. Tonight at the Weird Tales Tavern, we'll be bringing you his Degrand and Detective series novel published in the September 1927 issue, The White Lady of the Orphanage. The visitor before us was a gentle-faced, white-haired, smallish man. He was somewhat nervous and bowed to us both. Dr. Crowbridge, Dr. de Grandin. Good evening. Mr. Richards sent me. De Grandin lit a cigarette and said vaguely, I remember Richards. He sent you to see me. Is there something the matter? The visitor coughed softly, a little nervously. My name is Howard Jarvis, and I am the superintendent of Springgrove Orphanage. Mr. Richards is the chairman of our board. But gentlemen, the orphanage is in a terrible state. Mysterious things are happening there, and unless we can find out the truth, we will have to call the police. De Grandin made a sound of acknowledgement. What sort of thing? Let's hear it. Mr. Jarvis looked around the study, and then said, The fact is, gentlemen, that several of our little charges have mysteriously disappeared. Over the past 6 months, we've lost at least 2 boys and 3 girls. However, the day before yesterday, a 6th child went missing, vanished without a trace. De Grandin leaned forward slightly, carefully observing the visitor. You say they disappeared? Ran away? No, I don't think that's possible. Sir, our orphanage is entirely dependent on voluntary donations and welfare from patrons. And since we have a limit on the number of children, our conditions are better than most orphanages. The children are well fed and well clothed, and at least during my more than 10 years in office, there has never been a case of a child running away. Moreover, the missing person reports in the media indicate that all the children were present in the evening before the lights went out, only to disappear by the following morning. That's all I know. Have you searched? Of course. In order not to make a big fuss, the orphanage has spent a lot of money hiring private investigators and all sorts of people to find information on the missing children, but to no avail. Nor is there any possibility of kidnapping because every child spent a peaceful night in their dormitory the day before they disappeared. Several witnesses can confirm this. You said you spent a lot of money on this, haven't you? The opposite party immediately gave an affirmative answer. De Grandin continued, Excellent. Dr. Trowbridge and I are honored to be of service. But let it be understood beforehand that the fee for investigating missing persons is $500 per person. Do you accept? That would be $3,000 in total. De Grandin interrupted. Precisely. If you can't accept it, you can choose to call the police, and the police will handle the case for free. But as I said, the other party had just finished muttering, and de Grandin immediately continued. That's right. As for Mr. Richards you mentioned, why, I've known him for ages. Although he doesn't like me, he has confidence in my abilities. Otherwise he wouldn't have sent you. Tell him De Grandin, will take the case. $500 per person. That's the final price. Oh, by the way, care for a cigar? Care for a cigar, De Grandin said, handing the visitor a box of cigars and a lit match. The next day, at breakfast, De Grandin proudly twisted his golden mustache and told me, Trowbridge, you're still in bed. That Rich Richards was haggling with me on the phone, like we were second-hand furniture dealers. Eventually, he had his lawyer prepare a formal document agreeing to pay us $3,000 for the investigation into the disappearance of 6 little orphans. We're going to the orphanage tomorrow. Mr. Jarvis will be waiting for us. My goodness, this mystery must be solved. Otherwise, I'll lose 7. 0 francs. As we drove to Spring of Orphanage the next morning, de Grandin revealed, "Everything's arranged. Remember, we will appear at the orphanage's doctors to perform diphtheria immunization tests on each child, and we will do it individually." "Understood." I tilted my head and asked, "And then?" He quickly gestured, smiling. "Improvise. When there are no conditions, create them." We passed through the imposing gates of Spring of Orphanage. The wide, neat lawn was dotted with blooming flowers and rows of clean, elegant red brick buildings. The children were at church service. Their clear voices, accompanied by the gentle organ, were as pure and sweet as springtime birdsong. We tiptoed into the spacious meeting room, waiting for the morning exercises to end. De Grandin's eyes keenly scrutinized the rows of neatly dressed children on the benches, the pretty young nurses, and the gentle-faced, gray-haired woman playing the organ. At the end of the service, Mr. Jarvis greeted us. "Good morning, gentlemen." He smiled and turned to the woman playing the organ, introducing us both. "Mrs. Martin, this is Dr. de Grandin, and this is Dr. Trowbridge. They will be checking the children's diphtheria immunity this morning." "How do you do, Mrs. Martin?" gave a sweet smile and extended her hand to each of us. Mr. Jarvis introduced. "Mrs. Martin is our matron. The children call her Mama Martin because all the children love her like their own mother." De Grandin took Mrs. Martin's hand, then bowed and raised it to his lips, beginning his usual flattery. "Madame, these children are very fortunate to be under your care." For some reason, I felt de Grandin held her hand longer than necessary, perhaps because he was French. Finally, he reluctantly released Mama Martin's hand and turned to Superintendent Jarvis. "Superintendent, now sir, please lead the way." "Certainly. This way." De Grandin and I arrived at the office, placing the medical bag on the table and unfolding a white coat, and formally suggested, "It would be best if we examine those children individually, without any other people present." Superintendent Jarvis protested. "Mrs. Martin and I have already carefully questioned each of them. I assure you, and I repeat, there will be absolutely nothing gained. Furthermore, some of the children will be nervous if you question them individually." "If Mrs. Martin or I were present," de Grandin interrupted in his pre-anger monotone. "Sir, please do exactly as I instruct. Otherwise I shall be forced to." He paused, beginning to remove the coat he'd just put on. Seeing this, the superintendent quickly assured him, I certainly won't. Sir, I certainly don't mean to cause you any trouble. Please don't call the police," de Grandin repeated impassively. "In that case, sir, from now on, please bring the children to me one by one." During the questioning process, de Grandin began with sharp words, like a razor, but as one child after another entered the office, answered a few seemingly boring questions, and left the room, his smile became increasingly radiant. The last little girl, 4 or 5 years old, came in. She awkwardly twisted the hem of her apron with her chubby little hand, looking embarrassed. "Hello there, little one." De Grandin snapped his fingers, pulled a small box of candy from his jacket pocket, and stuffed it into her chubby hand. "Eat." The little girl immediately began chewing the candy, her eyes wide with curiosity as she looked at de Grandin, saying, "But, sir, they said, if I talk to you, you'll cut out my tongue." They, who dare say such a thing about me?" He suddenly cut himself off, turned and silently crossed the office like a cat, then grabbed a doorknob and threw the door open. Superintendent Jarvis stood outside, looking surprised. De Grandin looked sharply into the superintendent's eyes. "I say, sir, what were you looking for?" Jarvis coughed lightly, lowering his head. I just left my pencil here this morning." I was just about to knock when you suddenly opened the door. De Grandin interrupted without hesitation. You wanted a pencil, is it? Here you go. He went to the desk, grabbed a handful of pencils, pens, and other writing instruments, even a piece of chalk, and stuffed them into the superintendent's hand. Take these, and for heaven's sake, get out of my sight. Then he turned to me, his eyes flashing with anger. Trowbridge, my old friend, I'm afraid I'll have to press you into service as a guard at the outer door. If anyone comes looking for something, chase them away. I don't like it when someone is peeping through the keyhole while I'm questioning. A pencil. After that, I remained outside the office guarding while the children went into the room one by one, had a brief conversation with De Grandin, and exited through a far door. After the questioning, I finally asked, Did you find anything valuable? De Grandin thoughtfully stroked his mustache and replied, Yes, and no. You know, for young children, the line between memory and imagination is not very clear. The older ones, on the other hand, can't say anything, but the younger ones all tell a story about a woman in white who comes to the dormitory every night, and a child goes missing. Do you know what that means? Is it a night watchman? Or is it a white curtain blown by the night wind, then exaggerated by the other children? At this point, his demeanor suddenly became cheerful. Never mind. I seem to hear the dinner bell. My stomach's empty. It's like a drum. Come on, let's go to the dining hall. The atmosphere at dinner was unusually silent. Superintendent Jarvis seemed a little uneasy, but De Grandin enjoyed every dish in front of him and did his best to serve Mrs. Martin on his right. Madam, I believe you wouldn't refuse this excellent roast. However, Mrs. Martin looked at the juicy roast with an expression of disgust, replying, No, thank you, I'm a vegetarian. At the same time, a chubby, rosy-cheeked girl sitting next to her volunteered, Yes, Mama Martin has only eaten vegetables for half a year. Before that, Mrs. Martin suddenly stood up from her chair, leaning against the table, her face pale, her lips tight. She stared at the girl, her eyes showing anger, disgust, and fear, saying, Miss Bosworth, choosing to be a vegetarian is my personal matter. Please don't interfere. Seeing this, De Grandin quickly smoothed things over, and Madam, I understand perfectly. It's like a Buddhist who hasn't eaten meat since birth. Their enthusiasm for vegetarianism can't compare to half of those who follow the rules later in life. The dinner ended in an awkward atmosphere. As we left the dining room, De Grandin suddenly whispered to me, A very interesting dinner. Very interesting. Now, my friend, please drive me home immediately. I need to borrow a dog from Sergeant Costello. What? You want to borrow a dog? Precisely. A police dog. I think we'll need it tonight. All right. I agree. His quick thinking was beyond my comprehension. I knew it was useless to ask. Shortly after sunset, we returned to Spring of Orphanage with a large, fierce police dog borrowed from the local police station. As we stopped in front of the children's dormitory, De Grandin said to me, Please chat with Superintendent Jarvis. Will you? I'll take the dog into the children's sleeping corridor, tie it up with a rope, ensure it can't reach the children, but can fight with anyone trying to enter the building. Tomorrow morning, we'll return early to take him away. His plan was successful. De Grandin took the dog to the second floor of the children's dormitory and chained it up with a heavy-duty chain and a 10-foot length of thick chain. Meanwhile, Superintendent Jarvis was confiding in me, almost tearful, explaining again and again that he really was looking for a pencil, not eavesdropping, because he needed his only pencil to write a report. His words were so sincere that when I left, I believed De Grandin misunderstood him. The next morning, Before dawn, Degrandan and I returned to the orphanage, went into the children's dormitory, climbed to the second floor, and brought the ferocious dog out. After questioning the building staff, we learned that no one had been to the bedrooms after we left last night. However, on the floor next to the dog, there was a piece of tattered white linen, looking like it had been torn from a nightgown or pajamas, almost reduced to pulp by the police dog's teeth. When Superintendent Jarvis entered the office to greet us, I saw a bandage on his right arm. "Were you injured, sir?" Degrandan asked with faint concern, watching the superintendent's bandaged hand, his eyes constantly shifting. He coughed apologetically, replying, "Yes, sir. I was cut by a piece of broken glass in the dormitory last night. The wound is quite serious. The window must have been broken by the wind. Well, I don't know how." Degrandan nodded in agreement. "Indeed, broken glass cuts quite badly, doesn't it?" "Bites." Jarvis repeated Degrandan's words, his face showing surprise and a little fear. I don't understand what you mean." "I know. You are describing it metaphorically." Degrandan's expression was unusually serious. "Sir, I am not using a metaphor. I mean exactly what I say." With that, he turned and left the office, leaving the superintendent dumbfounded. I followed him and asked, "Degrandan, what do we do now?" "I don't know what to do, my friend. I'm like a sailor in a fog." "Trowbridge, take the dog to the car. I'm going to check the laundry room." I got into the car and tried my best to be friendly to the police dog. The animal was docile, besides opening its mouth to yawn a couple of times, allowing me to see its impressive teeth up close. It didn't do anything to frighten me. When Degrandan returned, he was furious. "Damn it, there's no doubt that Superintendent Jarvis is a liar. Last night, his arm wound certainly wasn't caused by glass, but there were no torn pajamas of his in the laundry room. Perhaps he didn't send the pajamas to the laundry, because that might reveal." "Excellent, my friend. Then can you explain why there are no torn pajamas of Jarvis in the laundry room today, but two ladies' pajamas are? One belongs to Mrs. Martin, and the other to Miss Bosworth, and both show signs of being torn. Let me have your deductions." Degrandan impatiently pulled his hand down from his forehead, then turned to me. "I've got it. Take me to the nearest chemist. If we don't find what we want there, we must look elsewhere until we do." We drove for half an hour along a small road until we reached a small Italian settlement. At the end of the only street in this small village stood a neatly painted chemist shop, with a crude Italian royal emblem hanging above it. Degrandan tugged my sleeve and ordered, "Let's stop for a moment and ask the owner about what we want to know." "Ask what?" I was about to speak, but stopped because Degrandan had already jumped out of the car and entered the small chemist shop. He spoke to the pharmacist in fluent Italian, and the pharmacist's replies were monosyllabic at first, and became increasingly long, their voices louder and louder. They gestured, shrugged, raised their eyebrows. What were they saying? I had no idea because I didn't understand Italian. But in the 3-minute conversation, I heard them both repeat a certain word. When Degrandan finally left the chemist's shop, he bowed to the shopkeeper with an expression I had never seen before. His eyes were wide open, full of contemplation. His thin lips were tightly closed under his small, golden mustache. "What is it, Degrandan? Did you find what you wanted?" I asked him. He replied obstinately, "Trowbridge, my friend, I don't know what I've discovered, but I know that perhaps we were terribly wrong. Please accompany me back to the orphanage tonight. I think the devil we're looking for is there." That night, he ate very little, seemed absent-minded, even forgetting to light a cigarette between dinner and dessert, only staring at his coffee cup and muttering, "It must be so, but who will believe it?" I sighed inwardly. He was always like this, silently thinking to himself, but refusing to speak his thoughts, a habit that always annoyed me, yet I couldn't change it. Near midnight, he finally stood up and gestured toward the door. "Let's go. It'll take more than an hour to reach our destination. By then, I'll see what I've been worried about." We silently drove through the countryside to Spring of Orphanage, turned at the entrance, and stopped in front of the administration building where Superintendent Jarvis lived. De Grandin got out of the car and gently knocked on the superintendent's door, softly calling, "Sir, it's De Grandin. I sincerely apologize for my previous mistake. Please help me now." The superintendent sleepily opened the door, looking astonished. He led us into his room and smiled foolishly at us. "Mr. De Grandin, what can I do for you? Please take us to Mama Martin's bedroom. Is she in this building?" "No. Mama Martin has a separate cottage at the south end of the yard. She likes to live in a detached house. Come, let's go. I'll take you there." Mama Martin's was a neat little building made of red brick with a low, wide porch. We walked silently along the brick path to the cottage, under the silent stars. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets in the grass and the melancholy cawing of crows in the trees. The superintendent was about to lift the brass knocker when De Grandin grabbed his arm to silence him. Our little French detective, like a shadow, quietly climbed from one large front window to another, intently observing the dark interior of the house. Then he raised his finger to warn us to be careful. He tiptoed out from the porch and began to circle the house, pausing at each window to peer inside. Behind the cottage was a one-story outbuilding, probably the kitchen. The shutters were tightly closed, but a faint light shone from underneath. De Grandin panted, pressing his hooked nose against the window pane. His intense gaze seemed to penetrate the curtains. We stood in the darkness for a while, when suddenly the tip of De Grandin's mustache quivered like the whiskers of a vigilant panda. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small diamond-studded glass cutter, licked his tongue, placed it against the window, and slowly cut out an equilateral triangle. Before he finished, he pulled out a thick square piece of paper from another pocket, tore it open hastily, and pressed it against the glass face down. It was a square patch of adhesive. When he cut out a triangular piece of glass from the window and carefully removed it using the adhesive, he made no sound. After cutting it out, he took out a small, sharp penknife and cut a hole in the opaque shutter. He stood there, peering through the small hole. His expression on his narrow face changed from focused interest to almost unbelievable fear, finally turning into uncontrollable anger. "Trowbridge, Jarvis," he shouted, unceremoniously shouldering the window, smashing it into dozens of pieces, then threw himself into the brightly lit room. I rushed after him. The shocked superintendent followed me, protesting softly. We stormed into Mama Martin's house, and when I saw what was before us, I completely forgot about the fact that we had trespassed. Mama Martin turned to look at us, standing there facing the blazing stove. Her rosy, smooth face showed demonic rage. Her blue eyes bulged forward, her twisted mouth smeared with a small patch of white foam, her chin jutting forward like an enraged ape. I had never seen such an expression on anyone's face in my life, not even on the face of a wild animal. But behind her lurked something even more terrifying. Something half emerged from the blazing stove. It was the boneless, fleshless forearm of a child. The wrist bones were still intact. On the tiled counter beside the stove was a large glass bowl containing a liquid the color of vinegar, in which 20 glittering white spots were soaking children's teeth. Besides that, a pale piece of meat resembling veal, neatly wrapped like a roast, was bound with string and placed in a wide, shallow pan, ready for cooking. You, the woman shouted in a strange, raspy voice. "How did you find me?" De Grandin replied. "Madame, how it was discovered is not important. What was discovered is what matters." For a moment, I thought this demon was going to pounce on him. Before we could react, he grabbed the glass bowl from the table, raised it to his mouth, and drank everything in it in one gulp. The next moment, he foamed at the mouth, convulsed terribly, and fell onto the tiled floor at our feet. As the liquid he drank flowed back from his esophagus to his teeth, his lips quickly thickened and swelled with brown blisters. I instinctively cried out, bending down to help him, but de Grandin pulled me back. "Don't move, Trowbridge. It's useless. The hydrochloric acid he drank is enough to kill 3 people. He's unconscious. In 5 minutes, he'll be in hell." He pointed to the partially cremated arm and the glistening meat in the aluminum pan. "Meanwhile, let's gather the poor fellow's belongings for a proper burial. I think." Suddenly, a suffocated gasp came from behind us, and our attention turned to the orphanage superintendent. He stood behind de Grandin. At first, he hadn't realized the horror of what we had seen, but when de Grandin pointed to the meat, bones, and stove, he suddenly understood, let out an unintelligible cry, and fainted. De Grandin went to the tap and filled a glass with water, saying, "I think we should attend to the living first, then the dead, don't you think, Trowbridge?" But as he was about to cross the kitchen to attend to the unconscious superintendent, a strange, low voice came from the back room. He put the glass of water on the dresser and rushed to the door, his right hand reaching into his pocket for his prepared pistol. I followed closely. As he stood at the doorway, I felt along the wall for the light switch and pressed it. Little Peggy, the child who'd eaten de Grandin's candy, was lying on the sofa under the window, her hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, a scarf tied around her face. De Grandin mumbled as he freed the little girl from her bonds. "There's another one." The little girl sat up and told us. "Mama Martin tied me up when she came to get Becky. She told Becky that I would go to heaven like my mom and dad. But Becky had to be good, and not to make a fuss when her hands and feet were tied. Here," she smiled faintly at de Grandin. "Why hasn't Mama Martin come to get Peggy yet? She said she'd send me to heaven in a few minutes, but I waited and waited, and she didn't come." De Grandin interrupted. "Mama Martin is away on business. Little girl, she said she can't send you to your mom and dad, but if you're a very good girl, you'll get there someday." At the same time, he reached into his jacket pocket, fumbled around, and finally pulled out a bar of chocolate, handing it to the little girl. "This is the best substitute for heaven I can find right now, dear." As we drove home in the dim dawn, I congratulated de Grandin. "My friend, you hit the nail on the head, but I still can't figure out how you discovered it." De Grandin's smile was somewhat pale. Perhaps the things we witnessed in Martin's cottage had put too much pressure on his nerves, for he finally admitted warily, "Part intuition, part luck. When we first arrived at the orphanage, we had no clues, but I was certain that these children hadn't gone missing voluntarily. The orphanage environment is good, but I could sense, like an old wound sensing an approaching change in weather, that there was something evil somewhere. Where is it? Who is it wielded by? The superintendent? No, he's too stupid. Mama Martin? No, she had a saintly appearance, but when I held her pale, soft hand, I found dirt and calluses. Why? What had she done to make her hands so hard? I thought at that time, perhaps my nose could distinguish what my touch couldn't. So I held her hand to my mouth. I examined it carefully, and finally smelled something. Trowbridge, my friend, I determined that those malformations on her hands were caused by hydrochloric acid. Do you understand? Hydrochloric acid. I was thinking, why would someone who doesn't need to do that have hydrochloric acid burns on their skin? Little Peggy answered my questions, telling me that she had seen it all figure, wearing flowing robes, a woman in white, walking into the dormitory where she and her companions slept. From the previous questioning, I'd already determined that no one would enter these dormitories after lights out unless there was a special need. Was little Peggy dreaming? Or did she really see this mysterious woman in white in the middle of the night? She also said that this woman in white only appeared on the nights her friends disappeared. When I had further conversations with the children, little Peggy told me that Mrs. Martin had warned her to beware of us, saying that if she spoke to us, we would cut out her tongue. That's something to think about as well. But while we were questioning the children, Mr. Jarvis was eavesdropping at the door, so my suspicions of him didn't easily disappear. As you know, after we placed the police dog at the entrance of the children's dormitory, wasn't Jarvis' arm bandaged the next day? I found that his window really was broken. That's nothing. He could have broken it himself to fabricate an alibi. But in the laundry room, I didn't see his torn pajamas. But Miss Bosworth and Mrs. Martin's nightguns were torn, as if they had been bitten by a dog. I don't know about Miss Bosworth's torn nightgun, but deep down in my mind, something was whispering to me. I couldn't hear it clearly, but I knew it was important. Then, as we drove away from the house, I suddenly remembered the scene at lunch. Miss Bosworth said that Mrs. Martin hadn't eaten meat for half a year, and Mrs. Martin got very angry when she heard that. 6 months. Think about it. For 6 months, the children have been disappearing, and Martin hasn't eaten meat for 6 months, yet she looks plump and well-nourished. As de Grandin spoke, I countered, I don't see how that leads you to any clues. He continued, think about it. If someone ate the missing children's flesh, how would they dispose of the bones? I replied, he would undoubtedly bury them. Burn them. Excellent. But he would need to burn them more thoroughly because buried bones would be dug up, while burnt bones are just ashes. But the teeth can withstand the fire of a normal stove. They would expose the killer unless the killer used acid to dissolve the teeth. That's the answer. Now find out who bought acid from the nearby chemist, and perhaps we can solve the problem. The Italian gentleman who runs the chemist told me that a very amiable lady frequently came to buy acid. She only knew the name of the goods, suggesting she wasn't a researcher in chemistry. She was a tall, strong lady with white hair and kind blue eyes. Wasn't that Mrs. Martin? I asked myself. She was the woman in white at the orphanage, so I decided to investigate tonight. De Grandin continued. In the Paris Police Department, many noteworthy cases have been recorded, not only from France, but also from other countries. In 1849, a beggar named Swadek was brought before an Austrian court for cannibalism. A similar case involving a young English lady, a very polite, well-educated girl, occurred in the same year. Neither of these two were inherently ferocious, bloodthirsty people, but their crimes were undeniable. In the beggar's case, we have a record of her confession. She really said this when she was first driven by extreme hunger to eat human flesh. She tore at the meat like a wolf, her throat emitting a bestial roar. Since then, she could no longer eat other meat, and she couldn't stand to see or smell meat. Beef, pork, or mutton made her sick. Didn't Mrs. Martin exhibit the same symptoms at the dinner table? Strange things happen often. No matter how learned we are, we know very little about the human heart. Mrs. Martin, although she killed and ate the children she cared for, we remember how she tied up little Peggy with silk, a way that neither hurt nor made her uncomfortable. Was that kindness? Absolutely not. Some people will cry for the rabbit they're about to kill, but they will always eat. De Grandin didn't doubt that there was something in Mama Martin's nature that we couldn't understand, something that drove her to crave the flesh of her own kind. She responded to the call of this craving. If she hadn't committed suicide, been executed, or locked up in a madhouse, that was her fate. Of course, without her, the world might be a better place. As de Grandin spoke, I questioned, I understand your thinking, but will Mr. Richards be satisfied? We found one child because we found part of his skeleton in the fire. But can we prove that the rest of the children disappeared in the same way? I think Mr. Richards will ask for a detailed statistical table before paying the $3,000. A sly smile appeared on Egrandan's face. What do you think will happen if we tell the authorities the truth about Mrs. Martin's suicide? I believe Mr. Richards will gladly pay our fee and won't dare to haggle. Ah, we're home. Come on, let's have a drink. Have a drink? Why? I asked. He smiled and said his final words. Of course, it's for the $3,000 that's about to arrive. Cheers. Degrandan's adventure ended once again. Compared to the last monster from the Malay archipelago, this case exposed the dark side of human nature, which was equally chilling. In Seabury Quinn's writing, most of Degrandan's adventures actually take place near Harrisonville, a fictional community located in central New Jersey, surrounded by all kinds of strange people and supernatural creatures. Wait, why does this setting seem so familiar? Those familiar with the Cthulhu mythos may have guessed already. Isn't this a replica of Arkham, located in Massachusetts? From another great writer of weird tales, H.P. Lovecraft, living in such a place full of talented people and spiritual energy. What kind of chilling events will Degrandan and his friend Trowbridge encounter in their lives? Let's find out in the next episode of the Degrandan series. If you like it, don't forget to like and comment to let us know. It's time. The tavern is closing tonight. See you next time.